I still remember the exact sentence my daughter-in-law said to me the night we buried my son. "Don't be dramatic, Margaret. Pack your bags and learn to live somewhere else." For a moment, I truly believed grief had distorted my hearing because no one expects to be told to leave their own home only hours after saying goodbye to their child. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 67 years old, and for the last 25 years that house had been the center of my life. My son Ethan and I bought it together when he was barely 32, back when the neighborhood was still quiet and the maple trees in the front yard were thin enough to wrap one hand around. I watched those trees grow taller every year, just like I watched Ethan build his life inside those walls. The day of his funeral, the house was filled with lilies and soft voices and the low hum of people offering sympathy that felt both kind and painfully distant. When the last car finally pulled away and the sun started setting behind the fence, the silence felt heavier than the entire service. I was standing in the kitchen staring at the coffee cups people had left behind when Lindsay walked in. She didn't look tired from crying the way everyone else did. Her makeup was perfect, her voice calm, almost impatient. She leaned against the counter, folded her arms, and said those words as if she were reminding me to take out the trash. "Don't be dramatic. Pack your bags and learn to live somewhere else." I turned slowly because I honestly thought she might be speaking to someone behind me. But there was no one else in the room. Just me, the fading smell of funeral flowers, and the photograph of Ethan on the counter from the memorial service. I remember saying very quietly, "Lindsay, I think you're upset. Maybe we should talk tomorrow." She shook her head like she had already waited long enough. "No, Margaret. Tomorrow you should be gone." The way she said it was so steady, so certain, that for a few seconds I couldn't even form a reply. My eyes drifted around the room. The wooden cabinets Ethan helped install on a Saturday afternoon. The small scratch on the floor from when he dropped the toolbox 10 years ago. The window above the sink where he used to wave when he pulled into the driveway after work. Every inch of that house carried a memory of my son. And yet my daughter-in-law was standing there telling me it no longer belonged to me. I wanted to believe she was speaking from grief, that losing Ethan had pushed her into saying something she didn't mean. But later that night, when I walked down the hallway toward Ethan's study, I noticed the door was locked. It had never been locked before, not once in 25 years. And that was the first moment I realized something in this house had changed long before the funeral even began. The hallway felt longer than it ever had before as I stood there staring at the locked door to Ethan's study. For 25 years that door had always been open. Sometimes Ethan worked late inside that room with spreadsheets spread across his desk. Sometimes he sat in the leather chair watching a baseball game after dinner. And sometimes he simply left the door open so the house would feel less quiet. But that night the brass handle would not turn. I tried once more just to be sure, slowly, carefully, the way someone checks a door they believe must still belong to them. It did not move. I stood there for a while listening to the silence of the house, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the faint ticking of the clock in the living room. Lindsay had already gone upstairs. I could hear her footsteps earlier moving across the bedroom floor that used to belong to Ethan. The sound felt strange, like someone walking through a place that had not yet accepted the change. I finally walked back toward the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water because my throat had gone dry. On the counter, the memorial photograph of Ethan was still leaning against a small vase of white lilies. In the picture, he was smiling the way he always did when he tried to make me laugh during family photos. I touched the frame with my fingers and whispered his name under my breath, not expecting any answer, just needing to say it in the quiet house. After a few minutes, I noticed something else that felt different. The small digital keypad on the wall near the garage door was glowing a soft blue color. That keypad controlled the home security system Ethan installed a few years ago. Normally, the code never changed because only 3 people used it: Ethan, Lindsay, and me. I walked closer and tapped the screen out of habit, entering the numbers I had used for years. The keypad blinked red. Invalid code. I tried again more slowly. Invalid code. That was the moment a small, cold thought entered my mind. Lindsay had changed it. She had changed the lock on Ethan's study and the code to the security system on the very same day we buried my son. I stood there staring at the keypad, feeling the strange realization settle over me that something had been rearranged inside this house while I was distracted by grief. Later that night, I sat in the living room with the lamp on low, unable to sleep, when I heard the front gate creak open outside. Through the window, I saw the porch light turn on automatically and a familiar figure walk up the driveway. It was our neighbor, Mrs. Carter, wrapped in a gray sweater against the cool evening air. She knocked gently, the way neighbors do when they are not sure if they should interrupt. When I opened the door, she looked at me with the same quiet sympathy everyone else had shown that day. But there was also something else in her expression, something hesitant. She lowered her voice and said, "Margaret, I was not sure if I should tell you this tonight, but earlier this week I heard Lindsay outside on the phone, and she said something about papers and the house being hers soon." I felt the room grow very still around me because suddenly the locked door, the changed code, and Lindsay's calm voice in the kitchen began to feel like pieces of a much larger puzzle. Mrs. Carter stood on the porch with her hands wrapped around the sleeves of her sweater, as if she was not sure how much she should say. The porch light cast a soft yellow glow across the driveway, and the maple trees Ethan planted years ago swayed gently in the evening breeze. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear the faint hum of a car passing somewhere down the street and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. Finally, I asked quietly, "What exactly did you hear, Eleanor?" She glanced toward the second floor of the house, as if worried someone might be listening through the windows. Then she lowered her voice even more. "Earlier this week, I was watering my roses near the fence and Lindsay was outside, near the side yard talking on her phone. I was not trying to listen, but she was speaking loudly. She said something like, 'Once he signs the papers, the house will finally be mine.' My heart felt strangely heavy hearing those words repeated out loud. For several seconds, I simply stood there gripping the edge of the door frame while memories began rearranging themselves in my mind. 6 months ago, Ethan had mentioned meeting with a lawyer. At the time, he brushed it off and said it was routine paperwork for work. 3 months ago, Lindsay insisted on reorganizing the filing cabinet in Ethan's study, even though she had never shown interest in those documents before. And just 2 weeks before Ethan passed away, I remembered walking past the study and seeing a stack of papers spread across his desk, while Lindsay stood beside him speaking in a voice that sounded far too sharp for an ordinary conversation. I had chosen not to interrupt them that day because I believed married couples deserve privacy. Now standing there on the porch with Mrs. Carter, those quiet moments returned to me with a new meaning that made my stomach tighten. Eleanor placed a gentle hand on my arm and said softly, "Margaret, I might be wrong, and I do not want to cause you more stress tonight." But something about the way she said it did not sound like grief. It sounded like someone waiting for a plan to finish. I nodded slowly because deep down I had begun to feel the same uneasy thought forming inside me. After thanking her for telling me, I watched Mrs. Carter walk back across the driveway toward her home, her porch light glowing warmly across the street. When I stepped back inside my house, the silence felt different from before. It no longer felt like the quiet sadness after a funeral. It felt like the kind of silence that settles over a room where something important has been hidden. I looked down the hallway again toward the locked door of Ethan's study and realized that whatever answers existed were probably sitting behind that door. But there was one more thing I had not noticed earlier that night. As I passed the hallway table, I saw a thin corner of paper sticking out from the side pocket of Lindsay's leatherwork bag, which she had left carelessly on the chair near the stairs. Normally, I would never consider looking through someone else's belongings. That was not the way I raised my son, and it was not the way I lived my life. Yet something about the words Mrs. Carter had shared kept echoing in my mind. "Once he signs the papers, the house will be mine." I stood there for nearly a full minute staring at that bag while the clock in the living room ticked steadily on the wall. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, I reached forward and pulled the corner of that document just far enough to read the bold title printed across the top of the page. Property Transfer Agreement. The words Property Transfer Agreement seemed to echo quietly in my mind as I held the edge of the paper between my fingers. I did not pull the document completely out of Lindsay's bag at first, because part of me still hoped there was a simple explanation. Perhaps it was paperwork for something unrelated to the house. Perhaps Ethan had already discussed it with me, and I had forgotten during the heavy days leading up to the funeral. But as I carefully slid the paper a little farther into the light from the hallway lamp, more of the title became visible, and beneath it I saw our home address printed in clean black letters. My chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with realization. This document was about the house Ethan and I bought together 25 years ago, the house where every birthday dinner and every holiday morning had taken place, the house where my son had grown from a young man into someone I admired deeply. I gently pulled the page out far enough to read the first few lines without unfolding the entire packet. The language was formal and filled with legal phrases, but one detail stood out immediately. It described the transfer of property ownership from Ethan Whitmore to Lindsay Whitmore. My hand froze in place. For several seconds, I simply stared at the page, while the quiet house seemed to hold its breath around me. I remembered Ethan standing in this same hallway just a few months earlier, holding a cup of coffee while talking about how much he loved the maple trees outside the front window. He had laughed and said he planned to sit on that porch when he retired one day. There had been no mention of transferring the house to anyone. I slowly returned the document to the side pocket of the bag exactly the way I found it, because the last thing I wanted was for Lindsay to realize I had seen it. Then I stepped away from the chair and sat down on the living room sofa while the clock on the wall continued its steady ticking. My mind began replaying small details from the past year that I had not questioned at the time. The lawyer meeting Ethan once mentioned in passing. The afternoon Lindsay insisted on reorganizing every file in the study. The quiet arguments I occasionally overheard through the hallway door, but chose to ignore out of respect for their marriage. At the time, I believed those moments were ordinary disagreements between a husband and wife. Now they felt like pieces of a story I had never been allowed to see clearly. I leaned back against the sofa and looked across the room at the photograph of Ethan from the memorial service. His smile in that picture was warm and steady, the same expression he used when he tried to reassure me during difficult moments in life. As I studied that photograph, a new thought slowly formed in my mind. Ethan was careful with important decisions. He never rushed paperwork, and he never signed anything without understanding it completely. If someone had asked him to transfer ownership of the house, he would have questioned every detail. And if he had doubts about the situation, he would have prepared for them. That realization settled over me like a quiet certainty. Somewhere inside this house there were answers that Lindsay believed I would never find. And the most likely place those answers existed was behind the locked door to Ethan's study. That night I did not sleep. I sat in the living room long after midnight, listening to the quiet creaks of the house as the temperature dropped outside. Every few minutes I looked toward the hallway, where Ethan's study door remained closed and locked, as if the room itself had been sealed away along with whatever truth it contained. Around 2 a.m, I finally stood up and walked slowly toward the kitchen to make a cup of tea. The simple routine gave my hands something steady to do while my thoughts continued circling the same question again and again. Why would Ethan transfer the house to Lindsay without ever telling me? It did not make sense. Ethan was many things, but careless was never one of them. As the kettle warmed on the stove, I remembered a conversation we had about a year earlier while sitting on the back porch. Ethan had been unusually thoughtful that evening, staring out at the yard while the sunset moved through the maple leaves. He told me something that seemed casual at the time, but now returned with unexpected clarity. He said, "Mom, if anything ever feels strange around here, promise me you will talk to David." At the time I had laughed gently and asked why he was being so mysterious. Ethan smiled and said David understands the details of my work better than anyone. I had not thought about that moment again until now. David Parker had been Ethan's closest friend since college, and for years they worked together in financial consulting. David had always been the calm voice during complicated decisions, and Ethan trusted him completely. The kettle clicked softly as the water finished heating, and I poured it into a mug while my mind continued piecing together memories. If Ethan suspected something about the paperwork or about the pressure he might have been facing, David would almost certainly know. The realization gave me a small sense of direction in a night that had felt full of confusion. I carried the tea back into the living room and sat beside the lamp, watching the soft light reflect across the framed photographs on the wall. There were pictures from family vacations, Thanksgiving dinners, and one photograph of Ethan standing beside David during a fishing trip in Minnesota many years ago. They were both laughing at something outside the frame of the picture. Looking at that image now made me feel certain about one thing. Ethan would not leave me unprotected if he believed someone was trying to manipulate him. That was not the way he lived his life. By the time the sky outside the windows began to lighten with the early morning sun, I had made a quiet decision. I would not confront Lindsay yet because she clearly believed I knew nothing about the document in her bag. Instead, I would call David Parker and ask a simple question that might change everything. As the first rays of sunlight moved across the living room floor, I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found his name. My finger hovered above the call button for a moment before I pressed it, unaware that the conversation about to begin would reveal something far more serious than a single piece of paperwork. I held the phone to my ear while the morning light slowly filled the living room. For a few seconds, there was only the quiet ringing on the other end of the line. Then David Parker answered with a voice that sounded tired but steady. "Margaret, I was planning to call you later today." I told him I did not want to disturb him after the funeral, but something important had come up and I needed to ask a question about Ethan. The room felt very still while I waited for his response. David was silent for a moment, the kind of pause that suggested he already knew this conversation would not be simple. Finally, he said carefully, "Is this about the house?" Hearing those words made my grip tighten slightly around the phone. I looked toward the hallway again where the study door remained locked and said quietly that I had seen part of a document in Lindsay's bag, a property transfer agreement. On the other end of the line, David released a slow breath as if he had been expecting this moment sooner or later. "Margaret, there is something Ethan asked me to do if things ever started to feel strange around the house." My heart began to beat faster, but I forced myself to keep my voice calm. I asked him what Ethan had told him. David explained that about 4 months ago, Ethan came to his office looking more serious than usual. He said Lindsay had started pushing him to sign several legal papers related to the property and some financial accounts. At first, Ethan believed it was simply long-term planning for their future together. But the more he reviewed the documents, the more uncomfortable he felt. Some of the language transferred control of major assets immediately rather than in the distant future. Ethan did not like making decisions under pressure, and he told David he wanted a second opinion before signing anything. I listened carefully while David continued describing that meeting. He said Ethan asked him a question that day, which now sounded very important. He asked what would happen if someone tried to rush him into signing papers he did not fully trust. David told him there were ways to protect himself and the family home without causing a confrontation. Ethan thought about that for several days before making a decision. David paused again and then said something that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "Margaret, your son set up a separate legal arrangement for the house shortly after that conversation. It was not a simple transfer, and it was not something Lindsay would easily notice." I sat down slowly on the edge of the sofa because my legs suddenly felt unsteady. I asked David why Ethan never mentioned any of this to me. David answered with the quiet honesty of someone who had known my son for decades. He said Ethan did not want to worry you unless it became necessary. He believed the situation might resolve itself peacefully. Then David added one final detail that changed everything. Before Ethan left my office that day, he handed me a small flash drive and said if anything unexpected ever happens to me, make sure my mother sees what is on this. For a moment I could not speak. I sat there holding the phone while David's words settled slowly into my mind like pieces of a puzzle finally beginning to connect. Ethan had left something behind for me. Not a letter, not a message through someone else, but a recording he specifically wanted me to see if anything ever felt wrong. I asked David where the flash drive was now. He told me he still had it locked inside a small safe in his office downtown, and that he had not touched it since the day Ethan handed it to him. Ethan was very clear. "Margaret," he said quietly, "he told me to keep it safe unless you ever call me asking questions about the house or the paperwork." Hearing that made a strange feeling move through my chest, a mixture of sadness and quiet pride. My son had known something was not right, yet he had handled it in the calm and thoughtful way he always approached difficult situations. I asked David if he could meet me later that morning. He agreed immediately and suggested we meet at his office around 10 o'clock when things were quiet. After we ended the call, I remained seated on the sofa for a long moment looking around the living room. The sunlight had now fully reached the windows, and the maple trees outside were glowing softly in the morning light. For years this house had been a place of comfort, filled with the simple rhythm of daily life. Now it felt like a place where hidden decisions had quietly shaped the future without my knowledge. Upstairs I heard the sound of footsteps moving across the bedroom floor. Lindsay was awake. I placed the phone on the coffee table and stood slowly, making sure my expression remained calm even though my thoughts were racing. A few minutes later, she came downstairs dressed neatly, as if it were an ordinary weekday morning. She walked into the kitchen without acknowledging the long night that had passed between us. I could hear the refrigerator door open and the sound of a coffee mug being placed on the counter. When she stepped into the living room, she looked directly at me and spoke in a voice that was cool but controlled. "Margaret, I hope you started packing some of your things. I plan to meet with a realtor later this week. The house will need to be prepared for sale." I studied her face carefully while she spoke. There was confidence there, the quiet certainty of someone who believed every detail had already been arranged. I nodded slowly as if considering her request, and said that I would think about the next steps after I ran a few errands in town that morning. She did not ask what errands I meant. Instead, she simply returned to the kitchen to finish her coffee, already behaving as if the house belonged entirely to her. An hour later, I was driving through the familiar streets of our town toward David Parker's office building downtown. The flash drive he kept in his safe suddenly felt like the most important object in the world, because whatever Ethan recorded on that small piece of metal was about to reveal the truth he had been quietly protecting. I parked the car in front of David Parker's office building a little before 10 o'clock and sat there for a moment watching people walk along the sidewalk with their morning coffee, moving through an ordinary day that felt strangely distant from the storm building quietly around my life. David's office was on the second floor of a modest brick building near the courthouse, a place Ethan had visited many times over the years when he and David worked together on financial projects. When I stepped inside, the receptionist greeted me softly and said David was expecting me. A few seconds later, he appeared from the hallway carrying a small metal lockbox in his hands. His expression was calm but serious, the way someone looks when they understand the weight of what they are about to reveal. "Margaret, thank you for coming," he said as he guided me into his office and closed the door behind us. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper, the familiar scent of a place where careful decisions are made. David set the lockbox on the desk and opened it slowly with a small key from his pocket. Inside was a single flash drive resting on a piece of dark foam. For a moment, neither of us moved. It felt strange to realize that something so small might contain the answers Ethan wanted me to have. David connected the flash drive to his computer and turned the screen slightly so we could both see it clearly. There was only one video file stored on the drive. The date on the file showed it had been recorded 3 months earlier. My heart tightened when David pressed play because suddenly Ethan appeared on the screen sitting at the desk in his study at home. The same desk that now sat behind a locked door. He looked a little tired, but his voice was steady, the same calm voice I had heard my entire life. "Mom, if you're watching this, it means something has probably gone wrong, and I am sorry you have to learn about it this way." I felt my hands grip the edge of the chair as he continued speaking. Ethan explained that over the past several months Lindsay had repeatedly asked him to sign documents transferring control of the house and several financial accounts directly into her name. At first he believed it was simply planning for the future, but the more pressure she applied, the more uneasy he became. He said the paperwork was structured in a way that would give her immediate ownership of the house, even if nothing happened to him. Ethan looked directly into the camera then, as if speaking straight to me across time. "I did not sign those papers, Mom. I asked David to help me put the house into a family trust instead. The trustee is you." The room fell completely silent as those words settled into the air around us. Ethan continued explaining that the trust legally protected the house so that no one could sell it or transfer ownership without my approval. "If anyone tries to tell you the house belongs to them now," he said gently, "please remember that I made sure you would always have a home here." When the video ended, David slowly leaned back in his chair and looked at me quietly. Outside the office window, the town continued moving through its morning routines. But inside that room, one truth had just changed everything Lindsay believed she controlled. I left David's office just before noon with the flash drive now resting quietly inside my purse, though the real weight I carried was the truth Ethan had protected so carefully. As I walked down the steps to the sidewalk, the sunlight felt brighter than it had that morning, almost as if the world itself had shifted slightly now that I understood what my son had done. He had not abandoned me to uncertainty. He had prepared for it. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, replaying his words in my mind. The house was protected by a family trust. The trustee was me. Lindsay did not know that yet, and from the confidence in her voice earlier that morning, it was clear she believed the paperwork in her bag would eventually give her control. That realization made me understand something important. If I confronted her too quickly, she would simply deny everything and try to move the situation forward before the truth could be clearly established. Instead, I needed patience. The same calm patience Ethan had used when he arranged the trust in the first place. When I arrived back at the house, the driveway was empty except for Lindsay's car. The maple trees in the yard were swaying gently in the afternoon breeze, their leaves casting soft shadows across the front porch where Ethan once sat drinking coffee on quiet mornings. I stepped inside and immediately heard the sound of movement in the kitchen. Lindsay was standing near the counter with her laptop open, speaking into her phone with a voice that sounded brisk and businesslike. "Yes, the property should be ready soon," she was saying. "I just need a few more days to handle some details." She turned when she saw me enter the room and quickly ended the call. For a second our eyes met, and I noticed a flicker of curiosity cross her face, perhaps wondering what errands had taken me away all morning. I placed my purse gently on the chair by the door and said calmly that I had met with an old friend downtown. She nodded with polite indifference and closed the laptop. "Margaret," she said in the same measured tone as before, "I hope you understand that selling the house will make things easier for both of us. The market is strong right now, and it would be best to move forward quickly." I studied her expression while she spoke. There was no hesitation in her voice, no sign that she suspected the truth had already begun to surface. I simply nodded and said that before any decisions were made, I would like to have dinner together that evening and talk about the future of the house. She seemed slightly surprised by the suggestion, but agreed without asking questions. Later that afternoon, I walked quietly down the hallway toward Ethan's study again. The door was still locked, but now I understood that the real protection for this home did not sit behind that door. It was already written into legal documents Lindsay had never seen. As evening approached, I placed the flash drive carefully on the living room table where it would be ready when the time came. Because that night at dinner, Lindsay was about to discover that the house she believed she controlled had never truly been hers at all.